Hello again to all of you school students from the Elgin area. You may remember me, Mr. V, from our concert last February when over 700 of you Elgin students came and visited me and the Elgin Master Chorale as we paid a tribute to the 200th birthday of Ludwig van Beethoven, the German composer. Do you remember that? Right here. This year, we are happy to once again bring you a musical offering. Well, actually two musical offerings that are a bit closer to home. Our musical presentation for 2021 is called Rails and Rivers. And if that sounds a bit familiar, well, it should. It's right out of your social studies curriculum. The geography and history of the many rivers and railroad systems in America, as well as those right here in Illinois. But today, let's take these subjects out of the textbooks and the deep freeze of a long winter. Let's thaw out the streams and fire up the locomotives with a pile of coal right out of Coal City, Illinois, just 70 miles south of where we stand right here in Elgin. Let's bring rivers and rails out into the wide open spaces where they belong, where they flow and churn and rise and fall, arrive and depart. Kids, let's put our rivers and rails into motion. Come join me now, every Elgin girl and boy. We've got it all right here in northern Illinois. From the center of your town, there's a crossroads that you'll find where man and nature came together in our time. Come back with me and hear me sing of the old Fox River round the first day of spring. Rivers and rails, rails and rivers, with man and machine, the goods will deliver with the iron horse. We'll steer our course to the great beyond, to the gateway arch, where a place where every possibility is achieved with human ingenuity. Now, the first of our two presentations will highlight the rails of our land, the mighty railroads that crisscross our great United States from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from the Canadian border to the Rio Grande and Mexico. We're going to take you on a musical journey by train across America. I'll be your conductor, Mr. V, with the music being provided by your city's very own vocal locomotive ensemble, the Elgin Master Chorale. So let's get on board the emcee Railroad, shall we? In fact, let's call her the Elgin Express. Let's meet up on the platform at the train station right here in the middle of Elgin, just a block or two from the Hemmons Cultural Center. That's your city's beautiful cultural arts center and home to the Elgin Symphony. And what a crossroads this is. You've got the Fox River Highway running north and south right through the heart of your city, while a river of railroad tracks runs east and west from Chicago to the towering timberlands of the Pacific Northwest. And we're right in the center of it all, right here in Elgin, Illinois. Did you know that Chicago is America's largest railway hub? And Illinois is America's busiest railway state. Take a look at this map. See how all major rails lead to and from the Windy City? Hey, we've got to keep this Elgin Express on time, so let's get moving to our first musical destination, way down south on the other side of the Appalachian Mountains. Let's head east for Kankakee and the Illinois Central Line. You don't mind if I sing a little song while we hum along the tracks, do you? Riding on the city of New Orleans, Illinois Central Monday morning rail. 15 cars and 15 restless riders, 3 conductors, 25 sacks of mail. Good morning, America, how are ya? I said, don't you know me? I'm your native son. I'm the train they call the city of New Orleans. gone 500 miles when the day is done. Oh, the city of New Orleans, it's one of our finest modern folk songs about trains, written by Chicago's very own Steve Goodman. Hey, look up ahead here. We've crossed the Ohio River, past Louisville, Kentucky, and we're going up even higher into Tennessee. The Great Smoky Mountains, right there. This is train country. You've heard of trains like the Rock Island Line, the California Zephyr, maybe the Wabash Cannonball. Well, let's hear our first song performed by your very own Elgin Master Chorale, directed by Andrew Lewis, concerning one of the most famous trains of all. Pardon me, boys and girls, we've arrived at Chattanooga, Tennessee, the home of the Chattanooga Choo Choo. Thank you, Elgin Master Chorale. Dinner in the diner, nothing could be finer. I certainly agree. Boy, you can sure see a great distance from up here on Lookout Mountain, overlooking the lowlands of the Great South. Yep, this is the same Lookout Mountain that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. mentioned in his I Have a Dream speech, in case you were wondering. But hey, now we've got to hop back on board our Elgin Express music train, and now northbound we go. Riding on the city of New Orleans, telling tales of trains that came before, passing 'neath the tunnels of the Smokies, while we pass along our stories from folklore. You know, kids, so much of America's history was passed along in the forms of stories and songs. Here in Appalachia alone, there are hundreds of tales about brave men, strong men, crazy men, and women who carved out paths among these mountains to allow trains to go up and down and over them to a new dawn. And there is no subject that has inspired more stories than railroad trains. I can't even begin to list them all. It's like one of those endless freight trains you come across back in Elgin that seems like it must be 5 miles long. I mean, you've got your gospel train, you got glory train, there's a song called Blue Train, there's Ghost Train, Funeral Train, Hellbound Train, you got your new train and your peace train, there's a runaway train, a southbound train, the love train, and a long black train. Now, what kind of freight do you suppose that long black train is pulling? What's piled up on those double-decker piggyback containers? Well, kids, when you see a long freight train, it's usually carrying one of 6 things: cars, auto parts, chemicals, coal, grains, and anything else that fits under the name intermodal. Now, what is intermodal, you may ask? Intermodal refers to goods that arrive at their destination by at least 2 different forms of transportation. So a rectangular container that comes to the United States from Asia or Europe on a giant container ship can be offloaded onto a train and even stacked to buy a little bit of extra shelf space, and then offloaded again onto the back of an 18-wheeler heading for the loading ramp at your local Walmart, Costco, or Target store. Now, back to our songs about trains. Many of these songs come in the form called the story ballad. These are songs that tell a complete story of a historic or fictional person or event. For instance, here's one you may have heard in your Rivers and Rails unit. It goes like this. Come all you rounders if you want to hear the story of a brave engineer. Casey Jones was the rounder's name. On a 68-wheeler, boys, he won his fame. Casey Jones mounted to the cabin. Casey Jones, orders in his hand. Casey Jones mounted to the cabin, and he took a farewell trip to the promised land. Oh, the great poet from Illinois, Carl Sandburg, he called Casey Jones one of the greatest ballads ever written, and that was just the chorus. Now, some of these song ballads about trains were called hammer songs, when the railroad workers would pace their work with the rhythm of the song text. Railroad workers felt great pride to be building something so monumental and historic, like a skyscraper, a bridge, a monument, or a railroad. However, when the Industrial Revolution came around, automation came to be seen as a replacement to human labor. This automation was rejected by many of the railroad workers, while superhuman men were celebrated in songs and stories and became legends. One of these legends was an African-American son of a slave named John Henry. Slave labor built much of the railroad in the South and in the East. It's said that John Henry's rise and fall occurred right here at our next stop, Big Bend Tunnel in Talcott, West Virginia. You've heard of a human playing chess against a computer, right? Automation in the computer nearly always wins. Now, imagine a human being racing a steam drill deep inside a dark train tunnel. And not just any human being, but the biggest, fastest, strongest of them all, John Henry. Who wins the race? Well, let's find out. Boys and girls, here's the powerful American folk ballad, John Henry. John Henry was
was a steel-driving man. Oh, Lord, the steam was a steel-driving man. Captain, he said to John Henry, "Gonna bring me a steam drill round. Gonna take that steam drill out on the job. Gonna whoop that steel on down. Oh, Lord, whoop that steel on down." Now John Henry said to the captain, "A man ain't nothing but a man. The steam drill beat me down. When I die with the hammer in my hand. Oh, Lord, I die with the hammer in my hand." Now John Henry went to the mountain, told the steam drill man step aside. Said, "Don't be steer like a steam drill man. I with the hammer in my hand. Oh, Lord, I die with the hammer in my hand." John Henry was a steel-driving man. John Henry was a steel-driving man. John Henry lifted his hammer, drove till his hammer caught fire. Last words I heard John Henry say, "I could drink the water for I die. Lord, Lord, I could drink the water for I die." Well, they took John Henry from that mountain, buried him down in the sand, and every locomotive comes roaring by and says, "There lies a steel-driving man. Oh, Lord, there lies a steel-driving man."
Well, John Henry and that event that caused his premature demise is marked by this historic marker and statue, where the legendary giant of a man died with a hammer in his hand. After honoring John Henry's passing here along the Greenbrier River in West Virginia, there's not much room to keep heading east. So let's follow the sun, shall we? This train is westbound, crossing Pennsylvania and Ohio, passing through the home of Abraham, Illinois, singing across the mighty Mississippi, rising to the Rockies of our land. America the beautiful, how are you? As we cross the continent divide to the Great Salt Lake where two trains came together. From sea to shining sea we will abide. Look up ahead, boys and girls. The Rocky Mountains, Pikes Peak, where that teacher, Catherine Bates, was inspired to write the words to America the Beautiful. Now, how in tarnation are we ever going to get this train up and over the Continental Divide? Well, you can be sure that the men who built the railroad looked for the easiest path they could find. Unfortunately, this did mean displacing many American Indian tribes from their lands. There's no hiding the fact that there were instances where our country's government took land that was not ours. Many Native American tribes are still waiting for reparations that they believe are due to them. Now, the men who built the railroad represented that melting pot you've heard about in America, coming from the east, along with the Union Pacific Railroad, were the Irish, the Germans, and other Europeans, as well as veterans from the Civil War and recently emancipated African Americans. From the West Coast, building the tracks and tunnels and bridges of the Central Pacific Railroad, came thousands of Chinese workers. Which of these two sides had it tougher? Well, the Central Pacific out in California had to get up and over the mighty Sierra Nevada mountains. There was no way around them. The Union Pacific, coming from Omaha, had an easier time of it, since the Dakotas and much of Wyoming were fairly flat. It was finally determined that these two railroads would meet at Promontory Point, Utah, just north of the Great Salt Lake, captured for all of history in this famous photo. On the date of May 10th, 1869, the famous Golden Spike was tapped into the track by the industrialist Leland Stanford. Then it was removed immediately, since the spike was actually made of 17-karat gold. If you want to see the actual golden spike, they keep it at Stanford University in Palo Alto, California. Now, although Mr. Stanford got to keep his golden spike, the real heroes of that day were the hard-working thousands of men who sweated and toiled for years to connect our country by rail from coast to coast. And you know what? I just know they sang and sang all along the way, don't you? So what better way to celebrate these hard-working Americans than our next song by the Elgin Master Chorale, led by their director, Andy Lewis. Here's I've Been Working on the Railroad. Locomotive machine that was built by those Americans and immigrants who worked on the railroad, the iron horse. And just like a real horse, this machine could now carry men, women, and families all across the country. A trip that used to take months and cost thousands of dollars could now be traveled in a week for $150. More than that, the eastbound locomotives could bring trainloads of timber, iron ore, coal, oil, and other natural resources, not to mention the tens of thousands of cattle and hogs that came to be processed and redistributed from the nation's greatest railroad hub, Chicago, the great commercial tree, the hog butcher to the world. Yes, we've got the Transcontinental Railroad, and Illinois was the center of it all. Now Americans were free to travel anywhere, except for those who had no freedom at all. The train had become a symbol of America's might, her vision, and her prosperity. But there are other Americans who saw the train as something else, something far greater and more profound. There were those in the South who saw the railroad as freedom, salvation, an escape from bondage, and a means to reach the promised land. You've heard of the Underground Railroad. No, this was not a real railroad with steel rails and a steam engine, but a series of roads and secret paths that zigged and zagged northward through the South as if it were underground, where it couldn't be detected by the authorities or the white slave owners. The Underground Railroad that Harriet Tubman and others established and sustained was a long, difficult, dangerous journey by foot for escaped slaves and their children in the South. But it worked, and the promise of the Iron Horse and the direct route north towards opportunity out of those plantations was sheer heaven to imagine. The tracks were laid, and the children were ready to lift every voice and sing, ready and bound for glory. Here's the Elgin Youth Choir, led by their director, Matthew Bishop, to put that euphoric feeling of anticipation and salvation into music with People Get Ready and Bound for Glory. hopes of those Africans and their descendants who had been enslaved in America's South before the Civil War were lifted at last by the arrival of Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. President Lincoln of Illinois had once traveled as a teenager down the Mississippi on a long flatboat journey to New Orleans, where for the first time and in broad daylight, he witnessed the practice of human slaves being sold on the streets. 30 years later, President Lincoln and many others like him courageously fought to allow freedom to those whose families had already been enslaved for over 200 years. The Civil War had ended and our country was to be one again. That is, until a tragic event, the assassination of President Lincoln on the April 15th, 1865. The simple man who had been born in a small cabin in Kentucky, who crossed the wide Ohio River and was raised in the dark, silent woods of southern Indiana, who, with his family, traveled to Illinois in hopes of a better, more prosperous American future, and who had traveled triumphantly by train from Illinois to Washington upon being elected our 16th president, was now silenced and still. Here, upon hearing that fatal shot that April night at Ford's Theater, the glorious Iron Horse that had roared across America, that had sped around hairpin curves with Casey Jones at the throttle, that had hauled tens of thousands of tons of timber and rock, steel, over the mountain passes carved out by the likes of John Henry and the Chinese and Irish railroad workers. This unstoppable train had now become a funeral train, bringing our nation's fallen leader back to his home here in Illinois. Yes, a slow-moving funeral train that would slowly pass through each city: Philadelphia, New York, Buffalo, Cleveland, Indianapolis, Chicago, and every small town along the long journey back to Springfield, traveling at a snail's pace and allowing every American family that lived along the path the chance to stand at the steel tracks and pay a last tribute to their fallen leader. I have honored that powerful event in this next song, a tribute to our majestic and timeless president who saved our union. It's called The Slow Train of Freedom. The slow train of freedom is coming back home, westward from the White House to the land he calls his own. His work now completed, no man can destroy a nation or the vision of this man from Illinois. Smooth rails carry him through the day and through the night. Free men to the left of him, free men to the right. The North and South united, two halves now were whole. All men created equal was his everlasting goal. The train's at the station, Springfield, Illinois. Thank you, Abraham, our Lincoln of the land. Your arrival's now at hand. Welcome home. Welcome home. Well, boys and girls, after our cross-country journey by rail, we're back in Illinois and finally pulling our Elgin Express back into the station right here in Elgin. What a trip it has been with our two vocal ensembles performing the soundtrack to our journey. We hope you've enjoyed hearing some of the songs and tales from America's railroad past. We also hope that the next time you're stopped at a train crossing, you'll consider what is the train carrying and where she might be heading. For those of us who spend most of our lives remaining in one place, the magic of trains will always allow us to imagine traveling to destinations beyond that remote horizon, to some future America fueled by the same courage and wonder shown by those who came before us. On behalf of the Elgin Master Chorale and the Elgin Youth Choir, this is your conductor, Mr. V, saying thank you, and please watch your step as you depart your train. So long now. Good morning, America, how are ya? I said, don't you know me? I'm your native son. I'm the train they call the city of New Orleans. I'll be gone